What exactly will the Russians agree to do, and what exactly will Don Kerry come back with in terms of a deal, and whether indeed can the Russians really be trusted to put the chemical weapons in Syria beyond use? Let's ask Margaret Kosel. She is an assistant professor at the School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Margaret, thank you very much for joining us. This really is the crunch bit now, isn't it? What Russia can actually do to get rid of those weapons. What do you think they're actually planning right now?
Well, as to what they're specifically planning, that's a great deal of speculation in that area. What we're hoping to see, a number of us are looking to see some truly implementable and executable process go forward, rather than it just being a stall tactic. We've seen some positive indications from the Syrians in terms of acknowledging the chemical weapons stockpile, but we haven't heard a lot of specifics with respect to it. So let's see what comes out of Geneva in terms of what are the path forward to implement and to execute some sort of international oversight of the destruction of the chemical weapons in Syria.
Surely the first problem is going to be getting their hands on those stockpiles. I mean, after all, these weapons are stored in places where there is a conflict going on. Can the Syrian government guarantee safe passage for the inspector teams to actually even get there? There are a multitude of problems in making this happen, aren't there, on the ground?
Absolutely, and that is just one of the first ones. You know, this question of, you know, will there be a ceasefire in effect? I mean, these come down to political questions, as well as ones of, you know, how do you do this in terms of logistics? What are going to be the requirements in terms of trying to get international inspectors from wherever they might originate? It's extraordinarily difficult to do them in the midst of an ongoing civil war. So that's the first issue that has to be dealt with. You know, under what sort of circumstances might we be pursuing a plan to try to either consolidate and then destroy, or destroy the chemical weapons at each individual site?
I mean, once those weapons have been seized, where do you actually take them? Are they going to stay in Syria? Is Russia going to hang on to them? What are the Americans going to want the Russians to do with them, assuming it's the Russians that go in and do it, unless it is an entirely international team that takes the weapons?
Well, it's not likely that the weapons will actually be transferred back to Russia or transferred to Russia. There just are a whole number of logistical challenges, including transporting chemical weapons in the middle of a conflict zone out of Syria. A more likely scenario would be either neutralization, some sort of destruction process on site, each of the individual sites, or a consolidation at a few sites within Syria, at which then some sort of neutralization, some sort of destruction process would occur. Now the next piece becomes sort of who's going to oversee and who's going to supervise this. We know that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is involved in the negotiations, and the OPCW, that's the international implementing body for the Chemical Weapons Convention. So that would be overseen, if they were brought in, that would then be overseen by an international body. Now again, there is the possibility of it being largely a Russian managed, Russian executed, or even a possibility of it being a U.S.-Russia bilateral agreement, bilateral effort, and again, possibly bringing in any other number of states to sort of oversee and execute the destruction of the stockpiles.
The Russians have strong-armed Assad, obviously, into agreeing this. How do we know the Russians will actually identify and be honest about where they're keeping their weapons and whether they actually hand them all over?
That's a great question. So you've got an issue of if it's done under the OPCW, the CWC rules, that would be then a situation in which Assad, the Syrian government, would declare what is their stockpile. Now, International inspectors don't go in to sort of look for, when they're going through the CWC process, they aren't going in to look for extra or hidden stockpiles. So there's a great deal of trust. Now, the verification aspect that international inspectors would be overseeing would be verifying destruction that was being done, whether it be done by the state that has declared the stockpile or be overseen by a third-party state like Russia. So there still is this question of, does one trust any number that comes out of the Assad regime, any number that is specifically declared and put forward by the Russians?
Here in America, there was a lot of skepticism about what the Russians' motivations are here, but Russia is saying that we actually have a track record in doing this. After all, they disarmed the nukes for a variety of countries. I think it was Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. They've done this in the past. Is there anything different between doing that and actually removing the chemical weapons in Syria?
Well, there are a whole number of things that are similar, and as you point out, after the fall of the Soviet Union, overnight there became 3 new nuclear weapon states. That was Belarus, the Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. And agreements were made for those weapons to be returned back to back to Russia, because they were originally Russian nuclear weapons. So this is one precedent. Of course, there's another precedent if we look to Libya, in which Libya agreed to give up both its chemical weapons stockpile as well as nuclear materials and some infrastructure that they had put together. So currently, the elimination of the Libyan sulfur mustard, sometimes referred to as sulfur mustard gas, is ongoing and has been stalled. But that's another sort of model one could look at in much more of a bilateral agreement, which does have involvement of the international community, but not in a way where it's led by the international community.
And there's one final thought: even if those chemical weapons stockpiles do get seized or confiscated, it doesn't prevent Syria from actually creating and manufacturing more chemical weapons in the future. After all, it's receiving the kind of materials and ingredients from, well, even European countries that can be used to turn into future chemical weapons. For example, the dyes that go into some fabrics and things like that can all be used to create more weapons. So really, the issue isn't over. We're going to have to leave it there, though. Margaret Kosol, assistant professor at the School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, thank you very much for joining us.